By the year 2030, an estimated 111 million metric tons of plastic waste will be displaced, unaccounted for, with absolutely nowhere to go. For decades, the developed world relied on a single, fragile, invisible system to just hide its trash. And then, that entire system broke.
Welcome back to Learning with Pratik. If you're new here, I try to increase neuroplasticity by exploring a new topic every day. I do all the reading and researching so you don't have to. Today, we're diving into an explainer on the global waste trade. We're going to completely deconstruct the collapse of the international recycling market, look at the hard data on which countries are failing, and explore some genuinely fascinating systemic solutions from nations that are entirely rethinking their relationship with garbage.
Chapter 1: The Recycling Illusion. For a really long time, a lot of us in the West operated under this highly comforting, yet completely false assumption. You toss a plastic bottle into a blue bin, and you figure, hey, it's getting processed locally, right? But the global reality was vastly different. The United States alone was exporting 4,000 shipping containers of garbage to China every single day. For decades, developed nations were essentially just boxing up their contamination problems and shipping them overseas. We totally linked our environmental footprint to China's massive economic boom. You see, back in the 1990s, China's rapidly growing manufacturing sector had this huge demand for cheap raw materials. So importing Western waste was actually incredibly profitable for them. But as time went on, the quality of that imported waste severely declined. The US and Europe were sending over recyclables that were heavily contaminated with food, unprocessable materials, and, well, just straight-up garbage. Which brings us to Chapter 2, Operation National Sword. So as we just mentioned, in the 1990s, the demand for cheap plastics kicked off this heavy reliance on foreign waste. But as contamination literally choked Chinese ports and severely polluted their environment, the government finally pushed back. In 2013, they launched Operation Green Fence. This was a strict initiative to monitor the quality of incoming waste, which slowed down port operations and forced exporters to pay hefty demurrage fees. But the real shockwave, that hit in 2018 with Operation National Sword. China banned the import of several types of waste, and they demanded contamination levels below 0.05%. That's a threshold so incredibly low, it effectively acted as a total ban. And by 2021, China indicated an absolute hard stop to all solid waste imports. The sheer scale of this disruption is honestly staggering. To put it into perspective, prior to these bans, China controlled 56% of the global plastic waste import market. That means more than half of the entire world's discarded plastic was flowing into just one single country. So, when those doors closed, the entire global recycling ecosystem experienced a catastrophic bottleneck. Now, the really crucial thing to understand here is the immediate, chaotic fallout. All that Western waste didn't just magically disappear, it was frantically redirected. Countries like the United States, the UK, and Australia suddenly started rerouting thousands of tons of trash to Southeast Asian nations, places like Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand. In fact, reports showed the UK's waste exports to Malaysia actually tripled. But here's the problem. These nations just did not have the infrastructure to process this massive influx. The result? Severe environmental pollution, illegal dumping, and eventually a fierce pushback. Multiple Asian nations literally started loading mislabeled garbage back onto ships and sending it right back to Western ports. The era of cheap offshore dumping was officially over. So, with the world's biggest dumping ground permanently closed, who is actually equipped to handle their own waste? Let's pivot to Chapter 3, the 2025 Global Waste Index. When you evaluate OECD countries based on waste generation, recycling, and landfilling, you see a vivid contrast between the worst offenders and the most efficient systems. If we look at landfilled waste per capita, we see nations that are simply burying massive amounts of garbage. Israel actually sits at the very bottom of this metric, landfilling a staggering 524 kilograms of waste per person every single year. The United States is right behind them at 447 kilos. And look, landfilling is incredibly detrimental. It completely wastes potential resources and generates methane, which is a highly potent greenhouse gas. But in striking contrast to all that, Japan landfills only 3 kilograms per person. They do this by relying on a highly mature sorting process and some very extensive waste-to-energy incineration facilities. There's also a pretty stark divide when it comes to actual material recovery. The data shows that while North America really lags behind, with the United States sitting at rank 36 with a 30% recycling rate, countries that enforce strict circular models absolutely dominate the top of the index. South Korea secures the #2 spot globally with an astonishing 54% recycling rate. The data consistently proves that countries utilizing deposit return schemes where, consumers actually get a financial return for bringing back bottles, those countries consistently achieve the highest overall scores for waste management. So, how exactly does a nation achieve a 54% recycling rate in the modern era? Let's explore a high-end systemic solution in Chapter 4, South Korea's Circular Economy. The foundational framework of South Korea's massive success is a policy called Jeongnyangje. It's a very strict state-mandated waste disposal system. It requires the precise separation of trash into distinct categories: landfill, organic, recyclable, and large items. But the kicker here is that citizens must purchase specific, government-issued bags to dispose of non-recyclable and food waste. This basically enforces personal financial accountability for the exact volume of waste that every single household generates. And this strict accountability extends right into their incredibly sophisticated food waste processing. South Korean cuisine features a lot of small side dishes known as banchan, which creates this high-moisture, highly saline food waste. Now, if that goes into landfills, it generates toxic leachate that can actually contaminate groundwater. Recognizing this, South Korea completely banned food waste from landfills in 2005. Today, they actually employ smart bins equipped with RFID technology. You scan your ID, dump your food waste, the bin weighs it, and you're charged directly for that exact weight. The waste is then crushed, screened, dried, and ultimately converted into animal feed, fertilizer, or biogas. This system is so effective, it transformed their food waste recycling rate from a dismal 2% back in 1995 to an incredible 95% today. But having the physical infrastructure is really only half the battle. South Korea also utilizes aggressive top-down regulatory steps. Under their 2018 Basic Law on Resource Circulation, they enforce a strict extended producer responsibility. What this means is that if a manufacturer produces electronics, they have specific recycling quotas they absolutely have to meet. The law also mandates waste disposal fees for non-recyclables, outright bans colored PET bottles simply because they're too difficult to recycle, and forces the rapid phase-out of plastic bags and disposable cups. They aren't just managing waste, they are systematically designing out unrecyclable materials at the very source. Now, while South Korea represents the absolute pinnacle of high-tech centralized waste management, Chapter 5 looks at a completely different, deeply human-centric approach: Brazil's inclusive waste systems. In Brazil, the backbone of the recycling system isn't made of RFID chips or automated sorting lines. Instead, it relies on human labor, specifically an estimated 200,000 to 800,000 informal waste pickers, known locally as catadores. Historically, these workers have been heavily marginalized, forced to navigate volatile markets with very little protection. And yet, they are responsible for the vast majority of the country's material recovery. So the really crucial innovation here is how Brazil has actually integrated these workers into the formal economy. Following the 2010 National Solid Waste Policy, which officially mandated reverse logistics and recognized these informal workers, catadores began organizing into formal cooperatives. This was aided by groups like the National Movement of Waste Pickers. What this did was allow municipalities to bypass massive corporate monopolies and contract these worker-led cooperatives directly. So when the government steps in to provide sorting centers and guarantees a steady flow of materials, these workers gain much safer physical conditions, predictable incomes that often exceed the minimum wage, and some truly essential social recognition. This approach offers a profoundly vital lesson for the developing world. As the Circulate initiative recently pointed out, quote, "Integration is not achieved through organization alone. It requires sustained public investment, consistent regulatory enforcement, and predictable access to materials," end quote. Corporate brands in Brazil are now literally investing directly in these cooperatives to meet their own regulatory requirements. It really proves that true circularity requires deep, intentional coordination between government policy, private sector supply chains, and the actual workers on the ground. Which brings us to our final chapter, Chapter 6, Rethinking Our Trash. The era of out-of-sight, out-of-mind global dumping is definitively and permanently over. The West can simply no longer rely on a single massive foreign market to quietly absorb its excess consumption. Surviving this post-China ban landscape requires a highly multifaceted approach, and the data shows us exactly what actually works. We need a rapid expansion of domestic processing capabilities so nations handle their own footprint. We have to implement deposit return schemes, which, as we saw, consistently yield the highest uncontaminated recycling rates in the world. We must enforce strict extended producer responsibility, forcing manufacturers to design for the end of life of their products. And especially in developing nations, we absolutely must formalize and protect the informal waste sectors that are doing the heavy lifting. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to consider about your own community. What actually happens to the recycling in your local municipality after it leaves the curb? Does it go to an advanced local facility, or is it destined for a landfill halfway across the world? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, especially if you have something particular in mind. Thanks for watching. Tomorrow, we open a different page. Until then, Pratik out.